Good evening, everyone, and welcome back. Let's resume our conversation, the reading of the story of Pinocchio, our second evening. Where we left off, we had noted the usefulness, the function of that mysterious first chapter, which seems pointless at first glance because it introduces a character who could easily have not been there at all. The story could have started in the shop, in Master Geppetto's carpenter workshop, and from there everything would have remained the same. Why? Why this strange beginning with a carpenter named Master Cherry who rejects the piece of wood, gives it to Geppetto, and from there the story begins? Precisely because in this, I follow the extraordinary interpretation of Monsignor Biffi. Precisely because Collodi, whether consciously or not, offers us an interpretative hypothesis for the entire story. It's as if he were saying, in an incredible description of the wrong way and mindset of Master Cherry, it's as if he was saying, guys, look, that if you want to understand anything about this whole story, you must not act like Master Cherry. And Master Cherry, I won't repeat everything, but what is he characterized by? He is characterized by what we could call modern rationalism, or even modern scientism, that is, by that attitude of modern man who has the presumption to understand and define reality. Reality is not, for modern man, something mysterious. Reality is not a sign of something else, but rather an object to be manipulated, to be transformed at will. And so Master Cherry denies himself the possibility of truly understanding it. Reality, to truly know it, because reality always contains something great, something mysterious, something that exceeds the rational or scientific understanding that man can have of it. It's the famous little voice in the piece of wood. And we left off. Last time we concluded by noting instead the way in which Geppetto, right from the start, Geppetto is clearly God. We'll see this clearly tonight. Right from the start, Geppetto has something wonderful in mind. It even brings to mind the definition that the Bible gives of the act of creation. When it says that God thinks of making man in his own image and likeness, that is within reality, someone who can, just saying it gives you chills, someone who can be his companion, friend, companion forever, and Collodi. He expresses it with that phrase you probably all know, I thought of making for myself a nice wooden puppet, but a marvelous puppet. And to think that for Master Cherry, that is for modern man, the height of imagination was, I'll make a table leg out of it. And that was really the best case scenario. God, on the other hand, when he thinks of man, he thinks of a marvelous puppet who can dance, fence, and do somersaults. And with this puppet, I want to travel the world to earn myself a crust of bread and a glass of wine. Traveling companions of God, and therefore destined for eternity. We come from eternity. We come from the depths of time. We were wanted here. The first question posed in an extraordinarily clear way by the story of Pinocchio is precisely this. None of us comes from chance, nor do we end in chance. Life is not an absurdity without beginning or end, but a gift received, an act of love. An act of love through which each of us is conceived from eternity and awaited in eternity. It's something that gives you chills. And when Biffy talks about extraordinary correspondences between the apparently secular text of Pinocchio and a Catholic doctrine, I believe that the chapter that demonstrates this the most is precisely the one we are about to read now, in which Geppetto creates Pinocchio just as God creates man. By the way, I don't remember if we've already mentioned this, but it's interesting to note that Geppetto, I'm not sure if you've ever thought about it, is the diminutive of Joseph. Joseph is the carpenter par excellence in the Christian tradition. He is the father of Jesus, and therefore, in a way, the father of everyone. And so it could only be the perfect name or within a fairy tale, the name of God. All right, let's read The Adventure of Creation. Let's follow it step by step because it's simply wonderful. First, it describes Geppetto's house and says, as soon as he entered the house, Geppetto immediately took his tools and began to cut and build his puppet. What name shall I give him? He said to himself. I want to call him Pinocchio. This name will bring him luck, he jokes. I once knew an entire family of Pinocchios. Pinocchio the father, Pinocchio the mother, Pinocchio the children. All of them were doing well. The richest among them begged for alms. A vocation, perhaps, a vocation for poverty. That said, the problem of the name, God gives a name. You don't give a name to a table leg. You don't give a name to a piece of wood meant to be burned. You don't give a name. To give a name means in some way to truly entrust to an object, to something that by itself would be nothing because it is taken from dust, here from wood, but in the Bible from dust to an object that would be nothing, to entrust something of oneself. It means to give your soul. It means to give your spirit. To give a name means to enter into the depths of what is before you, to know intimately, or perhaps even in some way to participate in the deep nature of a friend, of a person, of God himself, the whole dynamic, even the gospel dynamic of the name. We must bring it back to mind. How many times is it in the mention of the name that the moment of recognizing the other, of who the other truly is, occurs? This is true for Jesus, who is recognized so many times in this way. It is true for perhaps the most well-known episode in all the Gospels, the one in which Mary Magdalene, after the resurrection, finds herself in the garden. Do you remember? She is in the garden. Jesus' body is no longer there. She looks around, sees a figure, mistakes him for the gardener, even asks him for information. But the gardener turns to her and calls her by name, Mary. And it is at that moment that her eyes are opened and she recognizes him. To say someone's name is to express precisely the intimacy of the person. To give a name, even more so, is to entrust something of oneself to another. So Geppetto, who gives Pinocchio his name, gives a name to each of us. It is no coincidence that in a way our name is consecrated. It is fixed forever. In a sacramental gesture, which is baptism, receiving a name means entering into participation with the one who gives us that name. God calls us by name. He calls each of us by name. That is, from the moment we are conceived, in some way we partake in his nature. He gives him the name, and when he had found a name for his puppet, he began to work in earnest and immediately made his hair, then his forehead, then his eyes. Once the eyes were done, imagine his amazement when he realized that the eyes were moving and staring at him fixedly. A beautiful note, apparently contradictory. Were they moving or staring at him? Were they fixed or were they watching him? Well, both things. Because from this moment on, Pinocchio's eyes will be exactly like ours. In some way, drawn to everything, to all the beauty we have around us, to everything we encounter. In fact, to everything we come across, we are somehow attracted, and yet our gaze always remains fixed on. We should. In fact, there is a beautiful verb that has been handed down to us from our Latin tradition, which says that conversion, what does it mean to convert? It means convertere, that is, to shift, to focus your gaze on what truly matters. So our eyes, our gaze should always be like this, having this dual function. To embrace things, to look at things, to value all of reality. With an irrepressible curiosity that constantly shifts, perhaps from object to object, but always in search. Fixed on the one object, the one person who matters, the only person truly worth looking at, trying to. And here, perhaps the younger ones will turn up their noses, trying not to have fun. Because in the etymology of the word diversion or fun, it is the opposite of conversion. To have fun means to shift your gaze away from that fixed point, the only one truly worthy of being looked at, investigated, and sought after. In this sense, I am not speaking against fun in the sense of living, a joy that in fact should be the hallmark of a Christian. I am talking about that kind of fun which, as we all know, but we will talk about it again in the land of toys, makes this issue very clear. Well, the eyes moved and looked at him. Staring, staring, creation continues. There's joke about this gaze. Then he made his nose, and as soon as the nose was finished, it started to grow. The famous issue of Pinocchio's nose growing in proportion to the lies he tells. After the nose, he made the mouth, and the mouth wasn't even finished yet, when it immediately began to laugh and mock him. In this story, we have 4 moments in which there is a crescendo that will lead up to what the Bible calls original sin, the flight from the father, the escape from the paternal home in a crescendo, because right from the start, man who receives or who is still receiving life and breath from God is at every moment, in that very moment, immediately and strongly tempted to rebel. Original sin takes shape, takes on substance. What is the sin? Original sin is called pride, because that is the presumption of man to be able to give himself life on his own. He is still receiving it, and yet presumes he can do without the one who gives him life. And if we think about it, this issue involves all of us, because it should be the most obvious feeling we have about ourselves right now, in this very moment. The most obvious feeling we should have about ourselves is this: we do not create ourselves, but who among you, who among us, has given themselves life, or this morning, upon getting out of bed, felt that it was they themselves giving themselves life? It is so clear, so evident from experience that we do not give ourselves life, that it should be natural, it should be familiar, at least to feel gratitude. Then maybe someone doesn't believe, as we've already said, and I'll repeat it many times, the problem of life is not, first of all, God. If we agree on the fact that God exists, think about it however you like. But let's try to put the pieces together and reason as human beings. I mean, you can arrive at the affirmation of God's existence with your mind too. But there's something that should be stated even before that, and that's the obvious realization of simply existing. And for that, I feel gratitude. This is where it arises in a healthy way. The question about God, because if I have received life, the question is from whom? Who wanted me? Who placed me in the world? Who is waiting for me? Where do I come from? A truly religious question about God, about being, about destiny, arises from observing the facts, from observing the most decisive fact that I exist and I did not choose to exist. I exist, and this very fact of my existence is an absolutely free gift. Well, Adam, man, at the very moment he is receiving life, begins to feel, begins to experience instead the temptation of pride. I do not depend on anyone. I do not need anyone. And so in 4 stages, in a crescendo, terrible, truly terrible. And yet we are in the story of Pinocchio. So it is described in a very amusing, very ironic way. The mouth wasn't even finished yet when it immediately began to laugh and make fun of him. Stop laughing, says Geppetto. Then the mouth stopped laughing, but it stuck out its tongue. And Geppetto, so as not to make trouble for himself, pretended not to notice and kept on working. After the mouth, he made the chin, then the neck, the shoulders, the stomach, the arms, and the hands. As soon as the hands were finished, Geppetto felt his wig being snatched from his head. He looked up, and what did he see? He saw his yellow wig in the puppet's hand. Pinocchio, give me back my wig right now. But instead of giving it back, Pinocchio put it on his own head, where it half covered his face. At that insolent and mocking gesture, Geppetto became sad and melancholy. as he had never been in his whole life. And turning to Pinocchio, he said, "You little rascal of a son, you're not even finished being made, and already you start disrespecting your father. That's bad, my boy, very bad." And he wiped away a tear. Apart from the emotion you feel when you think of this God, holding a piece of wood, a clay puppet, right? He hasn't even finished making it yet, and he already calls it his son. Oh, son is a big word, you know. To call someone your son, you have to feel that their flesh, of your flesh. This mysterious carpenter who has in front of him a piece of wood, again, not even finished yet, and says, "Rascal of a son." It's already decided forever that that one will be his son. Whether he wants it or not, you might say, but the whole adventure of Pinocchio, all of Pinocchio's adventures, if they have any meaning, it's because this thing is seen, is realized, comes true, his nature as a son. God, who for the first time in his life, that is from eternity, becomes sad and melancholic. It is the greatest mystery there can be, the suffering of God. The suffering of God out of love in seeing that the one to whom he is giving life immediately starts to say, "No, I don't need you. I can do it on my own." Little rascal of a son. There were still the legs and feet to make. You see, it's a continuous crescendo. When Geppetto finished making his feet, he felt the kick land right on the tip of his nose. And here Biffy rightly writes marvelous pages. "I deserve it," he said to himself. "I should have thought of it before. Now it's too late." Guys, Godnum, who in front of man just created and already rebellious, says, now, how can it be too late? What could possibly be too late for God? It's too late because he can't go back. He can't regret it. Having done what he did, he will bear the consequences all the way to death on the cross. Said like this, Manu, it might sound like something from, it might sound a bit like something priests would say, you know, like someone giving a sermon, but thank God, anyone among us who has become a father or mother, this thing makes their knees shake. It really makes their knees shake because that's where we all are, huh? Because in some way, whether we like it or not, as fathers and mothers, we end up reliving the exact same story. And our children towards us, yes, in the end, the same sin, the same temptation, the same ingratitude. But you see, for a mother could never say, "I'm going back. I regret it so much that I undo what I've done." She can't. Because once life is affirmed in its value, that's the very thing we should have learned this year, which is called mercy. Mercy is a love that is no longer capable of turning back. It goes so far as to endure the ultimate consequence, but it never turns back. In fact, something beautiful comes to mind. It happened to me. Every now and then I go and read about these things, Dante, in the prisons, and I met an inmate, not someone who's in there for stealing jam, just to be clear, who, through meeting some Christians from a volunteer cooperative, well, it's a whole story, ended up converting. He converted. He's a man who came from Albania on inflatable boats. He really got up to all sorts of things, but he converted and is now living, to put it simply, to me, he's a saint, or at least very close to it. And he says that one of the first times he started talking about these things with his friends, he saw a crucifix and noticed it had INRI written on it. You all know that the inscription on the cross, the one from Pilate, is Jesus Nazarenus Rex Judeorum, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. He who didn't know this thought and thought about it. Do you know how he interpreted it? Reflecting on the fact that God had died for us and so on, he said, Ah, yes, of course, it must mean I will not go back. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. He really nailed it. He absolutely nailed it. There you have it. God does not go back. Inri, perfect. I deserve it. I should have thought of it earlier. Then he took the puppet by the arms and set it down on the floor of the room to make it walk. Here is another biblical reference, one of extraordinary clarity. Listen, Pinocchio's legs were stiff and he didn't know how to move. So Geppetto led him by the hand to teach him how to put one foot in front of the other. How can we not think back to the prophet Hosea in that passage we all probably know? It was I who taught Ephraim to walk, taking them by the hand, says the Bible. And here it's exactly the same thing. How many times will we find beneath the veil of the fairy tale, but beneath the language, how many times will we notice under the imaginative language of a fable, almost literal biblical quotations emerging, showing that Biffy's hypothesis is truly spot on? When his legs had stretched out, Pinocchio began to walk on his own and run around the room until, slipping through the front door, he jumped into the street and took off running. This is the flight from home. The flight from the Father's house is original sin. And original sin, the door is the door to paradise. And then that door of the house is the door to paradise. And ultimately, what we will do from here on out is nothing more than to go and see. To go and see all the attempts that Pinocchio makes to return to the Father's house. The entire adventure of Pinocchio, in analogy with the story of humanity, and from a certain point of view, with the story of each of us, is the story of these attempts to return to the Father, to return home, that is to return to being what we were called to be from the very beginning. In a series of falls that will bring into focus freedom, will bring into focus weakness, but will bring into focus with even greater clarity and even greater strength, a mercy. That is the fact I mentioned earlier, that God, from the very beginning, has always felt that man is his child, like Geppetto calling Pinocchio, "You rascal of a son," and truly he just can't bring himself to turn back. He goes to get him back every time, in every way, with every tool, down every path. These are, well, the adventures of Pinocchio, which are an astonishing gallery of all the possible attempts. We will often find ourselves, it will come naturally to us to identify with one or another of the attempts that Pinocchio makes. What matters to say now is to try to understand what the immediate consequences of this running away from home are. Terrible consequences. Terrible consequences, because Pinocchio's presumption that he can do without his father immediately leads to the destruction of everything. It leads to the destruction, the collapse, the very shattering of fundamental relationships, relationships with life, with things, with all of reality, relationships with other people, and even the relationship with oneself. But we'll take a closer look at this together after the commercial break. Montanara butter made directly from fresh milk.
Don't let incontinence take your place. Lines, the absorbency expert, presents Line Specialist. Protection designed to fit the shape of your body. Line Specialist has full-length side barriers to prevent leaks and gives you the dryness and protection you want in just 6 millimeters of thickness. So only you know it's there. Take back your place. Request a free sample of Line Specialist now by calling the toll-free number or visiting the website.
On vacation, we used to take it easy. Now she's always on the move. It all started when she decided to use Voltaren Emulgel 2%.
Voltaren Emulgel 2% doesn't go through the stomach but acts directly on the joint, providing relief from osteoarthritis pain for up to 12 hours. Voltaren Emulgel, the joy of movement. Back pain? You can try the Voltadol patch. It fights pain and acts on inflammation. These are medicines containing diclofenac, which may cause side effects, including serious ones. Read the package leaflet carefully.
Sometimes she's off-key.
Off-key?
Defying the laws of physics.
If you really love me, let me sing.
Nominated for 4 Golden Globes.
We could have been a family.
We are a family. Singing is her dream, and I will give it to her.
Including Best Picture and Best Actress. From the director of Philomena and the Queen.
You live a whole lifetime for this moment.
Meryl Streep is Florence. This Christmas at the cinema.
Love. True love. Clean. Truly clean. Ace Gentile. Its special formula, designed for colors and delicates, is super effective on tough stains. It sanitizes and eliminates bad odors. Today you can also find True Ace Clean in the new Ace Universal Spray. 100% Ace Clean throughout the house, 100% safe on colors. Look for it among Ace products.
So let's take a look together at what the very first tumultuous consequences of this and the running away from home are. Reading the text, I come across a figure I'd like to pause on for a moment because the topic is extremely interesting. The relationship between freedom, and therefore the issue of good and evil and how it is usually managed in social life, in public life, in our own lives. In other words, the problem of justice. Because our Pinocchio jumped into the street and started running away, while poor Geppetto ran after him without being able to catch up. Because that rascal Pinocchio was leaping like a hare. And as he pounded his wooden feet on the cobblestones, he made a racket like 20 pairs of farmer's clogs. Catch him, shouted Geppetto. But the people in the street, seeing this wooden puppet running like a racehorse, stopped, fascinated, to watch him and laughed in a way you couldn't even imagine. At last, by good luck, a policeman happened by. Hearing all the commotion and thinking it was a colt that had broken free from its owner, he bravely planted himself in the middle of the street, legs wide apart, determined to stop it and prevent any further trouble. But Pinocchio, when he saw the policeman blocking the whole street from afar, tried to slip past him by surprise between his legs, but instead he failed. Because the policeman, without moving at all, neatly grabbed him by the nose, Dungman, naturally given Pinocchio's big nose, Tandien, and handed him back into Geppetto's own hands. Geppetto, as a form of correction, wanted to give him a good tug on the ears right away, but couldn't find them because he had forgotten to make them. All right. And now let's get to the heart of the matter. So he grabbed him by the scruff of the neck. And as he led him back, he said, shaking his head menacingly, "Let's go home right now. And once we're there, don't doubt that we'll settle accounts." In other words, the father was doing his job as a father, and even with a few smacks, tries to correct his son's mistake, as any good father should do. But listen to what happens next. Pinocchio, upon hearing this, he threw himself to the ground and refused to walk any further. Meanwhile, the curious and the loafers began to gather around and form a little crowd. Now, when I teach Wa at school, I allow myself a few digressions. I get a few things off my chest when I do these things, and I identify the curious loafers. For example, no offense to my colleagues, but there's a way of doing journalism that really resembles what these curious loafers are doing. Why? What happens? They gather around this very amusing, entertaining scene, and they start talking. Some say one thing, some say another. The poor puppet, some of them said, he's right not to want to go home. Who knows how that brute Geppetto would beat him, others said. And others added maliciously that Geppetto seems like a respectable man. I don't know if you get the same feeling. I do every time I read this stuff, but I immediately get home. The same sensation I have when I open the newspapers. When I open the newspapers, I can hardly bring myself to read them anymore. Why is that? Because you realize there's so much that's contrived, so many lies. It's just talking, 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 often without knowing the facts, often actually, really so many times, without any regard. Then we make privacy laws, but without any respect for the individual, for what actually happened there. For example, with no regard, for whether someone is guilty or innocent of the thing, the wrongdoing they're being accused of. Everyone is always guilty, splashed across the front pages of newspapers, according to a logic that follows only, I believe, the fortune, the success of the publication, or even the career of the individual journalist. Let me say it, this crowd of onlookers and busybodies who probably know nothing start to sow doubt that Geppetto there, he's good, sure, but who knows what he's up to? Who knows what he does to that poor Pinocchio? He looks like a gentleman, but suspicion as a rule for living together, and alas, as a rule for information. You start speaking ill of someone, and then something is bound to happen. So much so that, in short, they talked so much and did so much that the policeman ended up releasing Pinocchio and took poor Geppetto to prison instead. If the policeman, as is obvious, if the policeman represents the institution, represents the system because in human coexistence, rules are necessary, there must be a law that helps, and so there must be someone to administer it, and therefore someone to punish those who do not respect that law. All right? People must at least try to do justice to the truth, to bear witness to the truth. In short, they try. But still, one has to say, what discretion, what a profession, what a terrible profession, that of the judge, that of the lawyer, well, of anyone who administers justice with what? I don't know. With what respect? With what capacity for forgiveness? With what desire to understand should they approach every possible culprit or every accused person? Because otherwise, you risk ending up like this. You risk ending up like the policeman. The policeman, poor guy, first of all, did his job. He heard all this commotion, steps into the street, grabs him, and as the text says, hands him back over to Geppetto. But then, influenced by the chatter of the idlers, the loafers, and the onlookers, he changes his mind. The judgment of the institution, the judgment of those who administer justice, is often influenced by things other than the truth, by interests, by opinion groups, by what the newspapers say, by what television says. So how many times have we heard people say something as if it were a moral law? They said it on television with the implication that therefore it must be true. So it must be true. Just imagine, because that's how it is, what enormous power the media have. An enormous power in shaping, in giving form to a certain public sentiment toward one person or another, toward a certain topic, a certain issue. It's the whole problem of managing power, economic power, political power, judicial power, power which to be honest, is not just about the power held by those in authority, because each of us has our own small measure of power. The power parents have over their children, the power of a woman over a man. While the idea of a man having power over a woman is almost laughable, the power of a woman over a man, the power of a teacher over the class. Each of us, in our own way, exercises a small amount of power. We at least need to take a look at the problem. The real issue is whether, when we exercise this small amount of power in whatever way we can, we do so with love and in search of the truth above all else. And within the word truth, there is always the dignity of the person, or whether our judgment and decisions are somehow shaped by what people say, by gossip, by the habit of slandering others for no reason, perhaps just to chase a bit of notoriety. It seems to me that this brings up the whole issue of the media and even democracy itself, because in that context, loving the truth should, well, not should, loving the truth and serving it, doesn't really have popular support. And, what strikes me is this dynamic. The institution starts off on the right foot, wants to do the right thing, but then changes its mind because the interests of others push a certain kind of judgment. In short, the opinion of the majority is not always the right one, to put it very simply. Sometimes serving the truth, actually, costs lives precisely because it goes against public opinion. You could also put it in a more light-hearted way. A referendum is a tool. Oh, I don't want to sound, I'm not against it, in fact, actually. The things I'm saying are because I want the tools we use to be as useful and effective as possible. I'm not speaking badly about it. I'm just saying that the word referendum, which seems to grant some kind of seal of truth to the will of the nation, to the will of the majority, well, that's not always the case. If I remember correctly, the first referendum in history was between Jesus and Barabbas, and it didn't go very well. We lost spectacularly, and it was the entire majority. And you know what? The other interesting thing about that is that the gospel notes, I don't remember which of the four, I can't recall, notes that when Pilate, the most famous magistrate in history, doesn't really know what to do, he calls a referendum, presents the candidates and says, so, one or the other, Jesus or Barabbas. One of the Gospels notes that those who had already decided how it should go had gone among the people to encourage, and basically to buy the people's consent. Even back then, just imagine, all right, to confirm this, not this hypothesis, because it's not a hypothesis, it's a real problem that we need to learn to look at and address. I'll read to you, because it wouldn't normally be part of the program, but it came to mind while talking about Pilate. I'll read you another wonderful episode, another episode that deals with the same issue, that is the problem of justice. At a certain point, Pinocchio, as you might remember, was tricked by the cat and the fox. Basically, they stole his money. He realizes it, finds out what happened, and runs into town to report it. He appears before the judge and says, look, this and this and this happened to me. He describes the whole story. Listen to this. It's terrible. I had the chance to read this at a meeting of aspiring lawyers, and we had a lot of laughs. Pinocchio, in the presence of the judge, recounted in detail the unjust fraud of which he had been a victim. He gave the names, surnames, and descriptions of the scoundrels, and ended by asking for justice. The judge listened to him very kindly. He was deeply engaged in the story. He was even moved. He was touched. And when the puppet had nothing more to say, he reached out his hand and rang the bell, as if to say, "Let us do justice." At the sound of the bell, two mastiff dogs dressed as policemen immediately appeared, and the judge, pointing to Pinocchio, said to the policeman, "This poor devil, this poor fellow, has been robbed of 4 gold coins. So take him and put him in prison at once." And you say, "Excuse me?" So this is terrible, which is like saying, "Look, I heard his story. It even moved me, you know. Maybe he even shed a tear." But the conclusion he draws in the face of Pinocchio's obvious innocence, who claims to have been a victim, in the face of his clear innocence, incredibly, he says, "Take him away then," as if to say, precisely because he is innocent, put him in prison, I condemn him. It's known that at a certain point, Collodi distanced himself a bit. When he was almost 50 years old, yes, he started to distance himself from the adult world because he was disenchanted, disappointed, and didn't want to have anything more to do with it. He had been politically involved and decided to devote himself to children's literature, to speak with children. He explicitly says this somewhere, precisely because he was disillusioned with the way adults treat each other and handle the important things in life, justice, the economy, life itself, in short. And here, his extremely bitter feeling of the impossibility of truly having justice really comes out. But what really strikes me is that Dunque there, as if he was saying it's inevitable. On the other hand, on one hand, you feel like saying, but no, you can try to be just. I mean, you can always try, even if it's precarious, always by trial and error, but thank God man can try to be just and to administer justice. It's not a given that it always has to go this way. But at the same time, what comes to mind? What came to mind for me is the Gospel of John, when it tells of Pilate's condemnation. There's exactly the same Dunque. The same Dunque, chapter 19 of the Gospel of John, Pilate actually says, "I find no guilt in him, therefore take him and crucify him." It happened there. It happened there because the repetition, but back then and now, in the story of a lay person who has to represent justice. So a court, a judge, a defendant, or rather not a defendant, a victim reporting the harm suffered, having to recall that, therefore, to repeat it well, it really makes you think. It makes you think about the fact that administering justice is indeed a delicate matter, which does require, not only from those who administer justice, but even more so, from those who set justice in motion, who provoke it. That is, the media. How much care, how much caution is needed, how much professionalism as well, and what loyalty to their duty as servants of the truth both sides should have toward each other. Then I repeat, this applies to everyone. In some way, we are all journalists, because in some way, we use information and communicate it. In some way, we are all teachers and educators. We all have our own power, as I mentioned earlier. The story of Pinocchio here strongly brings the theme of responsibility to the forefront, the responsibility that each of us has towards others, towards living together with others, towards the issue of good and evil. Evil exists, and we all do evil. The extraordinary thing we learn, and will learn precisely from Pinocchio and his story, is that the demand for justice among people only makes sense if there truly is justice with a capital J. In the end, if there is a father, then by comparing ourselves to him, by comparing the way he treats us, we can try to be just. Otherwise, there's no way you end up like the policeman. You end up like the policeman because inevitably you become subservient to some master and thus pursue interests that, if there is no truth, clearly what is left for you to serve in doing your job, in living out your responsibilities? If God does not exist, then everything is the same. Dostoevsky. If God does not exist, everything is the same. If there is no truth, then there is neither good nor evil. There is nothing left to punish by law, except for what goes against my own interests. And so it truly becomes a war, a war. How did the philosopher put it? Homo homini lupus. Each of us is a wolf to the others. Or to use Dante's words, each of us is hell for the others. The fact remains that our Pinocchio finds himself free. He finds himself free. The misunderstanding with the policeman, the institutional misunderstanding in some way fulfills his misguided wish. That wish of his to equate freedom, real life, with being able to do without his father. So I'll tell you, kids, that while poor Geppetto was being taken to prison through no fault of his own, that rascal Pinocchio, now free from the clutches of the policeman, took off running across the fields to get home as quickly as possible. And in his mad dash, he leapt over tall embankments, thorny hedges, and ditches full of water, just like a little goat or a young hare being chased by hunters would do. When he reached the front of the house, he found the street door ajar and pushed it open, went inside, and as soon as he had slid the bolt across, he threw himself down on the floor, letting out a great sigh of relief. It is the illusion, the tragic illusion of Pinocchio, of man who imagines that doing without God, doing without a father, in short, not having to depend on anyone, is the attainment of the ideal of freedom for which, moreover, he feels he was made. With his arrival home, with this big sigh of contentment, which, however, will immediately have to reckon with the talking cricket, the whole issue of freedom is brought to the forefront, and I'll sum it up briefly. The entire problem of freedom is put on the table. Why? I'll put it in perhaps rather simple terms. The problem of freedom is very simple. Yes, it's very simple. There's a widespread common misunderstanding, one we hardly even need to think about, but we identify precisely because of the debt we owe to the culture in which we were born and have lived, and not just us, but a culture that has developed since the French Revolution. We identify freedom with not having to depend on anyone. It's a joke that, well, a sort of joke, something I often did in class. I would say to the students, listen, the problem of freedom is a big one, you know. Write down on a sheet of paper what you think freedom is. Want to bet I can guess everything you write? Easy. What do they write? Because they write the nonsense we all know. Freedom is being able to do whatever I want. Freedom is not depending on anyone. Freedom is having no ties, all that nonsense. And then you get them to think for a moment and say, but are you sure? Do you really believe that? Try thinking about it for a second. If you really had to cut all your ties, what would you have left? I mean, what would you be without those ties? It's like if someone were to say, another example I always use in class, it's like if someone were to say, that's it. I'm tired of being identified with my father and mother. I walk down the street. People look at me and say, hey, you look like Maria. Yes, I'm her son. You go somewhere else. You cough once. And who hears you? Ah, Ma, that must be Giuseppe's grandson over there. From your voice, your nose, your height, your personality, you are identifiable. Because of the ties that make you who you are. If someone were to say, enough, I'm fed up with being Maria's son, Giuseppe's grandson. I just want to be myself, that's it. And if he went back, if I gave him a time machine and he could go back and said, Mamdi, to finally be free, I'll shoot my father and mother before they get married. That way, I erase all the dependency I carry with me. What would happen? It would amount to your own suicide, that is to death, to non-existence, because you are the ties that make you who you are. And the more ties a person has, the richer they are and the stronger their personality. So much for not depending on anyone. It's exactly the opposite. Freedom is the awareness you have of the ties that make you who you are, the strength with which you live them, and also the critical sense with which you experience them, of course. So not like a slave, not like a fool whose thinking depends on others, no. But how can I put it? The legacy you carry with you, eh? The legacy that is handed down to you, what is called authority, or better yet, tradition. There it is. A person's strength is their history, meaning the ties they have, the tradition, what lies behind them, the strength of a past, the strength of a story. It is because we belong that we are strong. If someone belongs to no one, you could say if someone belongs to no one, they don't exist. The truth is that if someone doesn't have a father, they have a master. They have a master. In life, you end up discovering that the choice is stark in either Geppetto or Mangiafuoco. We will see this clearly in the next episodes, either a father or a master. The idea that freedom means having neither one nor the other, that is, that we exist as individuals without relationships, is truly nonsense. It's a lie, perhaps the gravest lie of modernity. We will find this abundantly documented in the upcoming Adventures of Pinocchio. See you next time.